judge laughed right in his face. The prosecution thought the case was over. But when this black man took control of the courtroom, he left everyone, judge included, utterly speechless. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators, journalists poised with notepads, and a jury that seemed to have made up their minds before a single word was even spoken. At the center sat Jonathan Ellis, alone at the defendant's table, calmly adjusting his navy blue tie. He wasn't a lawyer, not officially anyway, but he knew the law better than most so-called experts in that room. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back, lightly tapping his gavel against the bench with a barely concealed smile. He'd seen men like Jonathan before, men who believed they could outsmart the system with fancy talk and misplaced confidence. It never worked. "Mr. Ellis," the judge said, raising an eyebrow, "I assume you understand the risks of representing yourself in a case of this scale?" Jonathan nodded, his face unreadable. "Very well," Calloway said, barely holding back a smirk. "Proceed." Quiet chuckles rippled across the prosecution's table. Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, exchanged looks with his co-counsel, shaking his head as if this was already a lost cause. They weren't worried. The evidence against Jonathan seemed airtight. Jonathan had been a mid-level financial consultant at Wilson Harrington, one of Phoenix, Arizona's largest investment firms. When nearly $500,000 vanished, his name appeared all over suspicious transactions. The firm wasted no time throwing him under the bus. His boss, Franklin Dorsey, claimed Jonathan had exclusive access to the accounts involved. Multiple reports showed fraudulent wire transfers made from his work computer. Investigators found unexplained deposits in an offshore account tied to his Social Security number. The case seemed closed. Judge Calloway glanced at the jury, then back at Jonathan. "Mr. Ellis, the prosecution says they have overwhelming evidence against you, yet instead of hiring an attorney, you've chosen to represent yourself. Just curious, do you hold a law degree I might not know about?" Laughter broke out again from the prosecution, and even some jurors smiled. Jonathan met the judge's gaze steadily. "No, I don't have a law degree," he said, "but I know the law. More importantly, I know the truth." The laughter died. The judge's face flickered with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Very well," Calloway said, flipping open his notes. "Let's hear it then. The state of Arizona versus Jonathan Ellis. Prosecution, you may begin." The first witness was a former colleague, someone who once smiled at Jonathan but was now ready to testify against him. Yet Jonathan remained calm. He had prepared for this moment for months. No one in the courtroom was ready for what came next. The bailiff's voice echoed, "The prosecution calls Franklin Dorsey to the stand." Jonathan sat perfectly still, hands folded on the defense table. Franklin Dorsey, his former boss, was a man known for his charm and ruthless ambition, the kind of executive who smiled while making sure a knife was aimed at your back. Dorsey approached the witness stand with confidence, buttoning his tailored suit as he sat. The prosecution had chosen well. Who better to paint Jonathan as guilty than the man who once signed his paycheck? Adam Grayson approached with satisfaction. "Mr. Dorsey, how long have you known the defendant?" Dorsey cleared his throat. "About 7 years. He was one of my financial consultants." "And how would you describe his work?" "He was good, smart, meticulous, and knowledgeable about investment law," Dorsey said, then sighed heavily. "Which is why this is so disappointing." The prosecution was setting the stage, aiming to sway the jury. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe Jonathan was skilled enough to commit the crime, but completely untrustworthy to do so. Adam Grayson nodded and asked, "Can you explain what happened when the missing funds were discovered?" Franklin Dorsey folded his hands and said, "We ran a standard quarterly audit. That's when we noticed the irregularities, large sums moving into accounts that shouldn't even exist. We launched an internal investigation immediately." He turned to the jury, lowering his voice for effect. Every trail led right back to Jonathan Ellis. Jonathan remained calm. He'd heard it all before. The The first time when he was abruptly fired and escorted out like a common criminal. The second time when the police showed up with a warrant. Now, the prosecution was making sure the jury saw him exactly as they wanted. Guilty. Grayson walked toward the evidence table. Your Honor, Exhibit A. A large screen lit up with bank statements showing multiple deposits into an offshore account. These transfers came directly from the defendant's work computer, Grayson said, pointing at the documents. The login credentials match his employee ID. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. The evidence looked solid. Even Jonathan knew it seemed damning on the surface. Grayson let the silence hang before continuing. Mr. Dorsey, to your knowledge, did anyone else have access to the defendant's login credentials? No, Dorsey said without hesitation. Only Jonathan. Another pause. A careful glance at the jury. Then Grayson delivered his final blow. In your professional opinion, Mr. Dorsey, is there any reasonable doubt that Jonathan Ellis was behind these transfers? Dorsey leaned forward slightly. None whatsoever. Grayson turned to the judge. No further questions. Judge Calloway gave a slight nod. Mr. Ellis, your witness. Jonathan stood up, buttoned his jacket, and approached the witness stand with deliberate calm. The energy in the room shifted subtly. The prosecution remained confident. The jury began to hesitate, and the judge still watched with amusement. But Jonathan had patience. He let the moment stretch before speaking. Mr. Dorsey, Jonathan began, his voice steady, you said I was one of your financial consultants? Dorsey tilted his head as if the answer was obvious. Yes, and you claim I was the only one with access to those accounts. That's right, Jonathan nodded, glancing at the jury. How many employees worked in Wilson Harrington's financial division? Dorsey hesitated. Roughly 50, I'd say. And how many had clearance for financial transactions? Another pause, shorter this time. About a dozen. Jonathan nodded slowly. A dozen employees with clearance. Yet, under oath, you're telling this court not one of those other employees could have accessed my login credentials? Dorsey shifted in his seat. It was assigned specifically to you. Jonathan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're right, it was. But let's talk about that. He took a few steps, letting his words settle. Would you say most employees use their work computers daily? Dorsey frowned. Of course. And were those computers ever left unattended? Say, during lunch breaks, meetings, or quick trips to the bathroom? Silence. Jonathan turned to the jury. Because here's the truth. I left my computer unattended plenty of times, just like everyone else, and anyone with half a brain could have walked up, typed in a few numbers, and framed me for something I didn't do. Dorsey's jaw tightened. The jury was listening closely, but Jonathan wasn't finished. What he revealed next would flip the entire case on its head. The courtroom fell silent, not the usual kind of quiet, but the kind that means everyone is listening intently. The jury stopped shifting. Even Judge Calloway, who had spent much of the trial amused or annoyed, now watched Jonathan with genuine interest. Jonathan returned to the defense table and picked up a thick folder, holding it up just enough for the jury to see. These, he said, tapping the cover, are copies of the company's internal security logs, every login activity for every employee with financial clearance. He flipped through the pages casually, then looked back at Dorsey. You said I was the only person who could have made those transfers. Dorsey nodded slowly. Jonathan took a breath and walked toward the large screen where the prosecution's so-called airtight evidence still displayed. Your Honor, Jonathan said, with the court's permission, I'd like to present a timeline of login activities from the day these fraudulent transactions occurred. Judge Calloway sighed but gave a wave of approval. The judge gestured, proceed. Jonathan turned to the screen. Exhibit B. The screen lit up once more, this time revealing login logs that hadn't been shown before. Jonathan zoomed in on the first timestamp and circled it with his laser pointer. This, he said, is when the first fraudulent transaction occurred, at 10:42 a.m. He clicked again, highlighting another entry. And this, 10:39 a.m., is the exact time I swiped my badge to leave the building for an off-site client meeting. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Jonathan continued, clicking to reveal the next timestamp. This, he pointed out, is the second fraudulent transfer, 2:17 p.m. Then he zoomed in on another part of the logs. And this, he said, is the time I was sitting in an office across town, giving a presentation to potential investors, documented, recorded, and emailed to half the executive board. The courtroom shifted in their seats. The judge leaned forward slightly, the prosecution's expression hardened, and Grayson's smile vanished. Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to Dorsey. "Mr. Dorsey, did you personally review these logs before accusing me of fraud?" Dorsey hesitated. The IT department handled the investigation. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "So, you never personally checked the logs?" Dorsey cleared his throat. "That wasn't my responsibility." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Right. But accusing me publicly, having me arrested, and testifying under oath that I was the only person who could have made those transfers, that was your job." Dorsey opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. Jonathan let the silence stretch, then spoke again. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case based on unreliable evidence. Or at the very least, I request a full forensic analysis of these login records because a proper audit would reveal exactly which computer, IP address, and employee credentials accessed those accounts." Judge Calloway rubbed his temple, the earlier amusement now gone. "Mr. Grayson," the judge said, turning to the prosecution, "any explanation for this?" Grayson stood quickly, though Jonathan noticed a hesitation in his movement. "Your Honor, while the defense's logs are certainly interesting, they don't necessarily clear Mr. Ellis. It's possible he arranged for someone else to carry out these transactions on his behalf." Jonathan smiled, not out of pleasure, but because he recognized desperation when he saw it. "So now the theory is I had a secret accomplice?" He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution spent this entire trial claiming I acted alone. Now caught in their own web, they want to change the story." He let the statement hang before delivering his final point. "But let's test their new theory. If I had an accomplice, why would I leave a paper trail directly tied to my name? Why use my login, my work computer, and my offshore account to steal money in the most obvious way possible?" Murmurs spread through the jury. Jonathan faced Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a new witness to the stand." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And who would that be?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Mark Singleton." The moment the name left his mouth, Dorsey's face changed, a flicker of panic, subtle, but unmistakable. Jonathan knew then he had them. The air in the courtroom shifted. When Jonathan said, "Mark Singleton," even the jury caught the tension. Grayson quickly stood. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to introduce an unlisted witness. There was no prior disclosure." Jonathan cut him off. "Actually, Your Honor, Mark Singleton was on the original employee roster provided by the prosecution during discovery. He worked in the financial department, had clearance to company accounts, and left the company just 2 weeks after I was fired." Judge Calloway narrowed his gaze. "Mr. Ellis, are you suggesting this witness has direct knowledge of the transactions?" Jonathan locked eyes with the judge. "I'm suggesting he's the one who made them." Silence. The judge exhaled, clearly rethinking the entire case. After a long pause, he said, "Bring Mark Singleton into the courtroom." A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, and even some jurors exchanged curious glances. This was supposed to be an easy conviction. Now no one knew what was coming next. Mark Singleton entered with a neutral, almost too neutral expression. He was a thin, wiry man in his late 40s with graying hair and nervous energy he tried hard to hide. Jonathan knew exactly what to look for. Singleton took the stand and Mark Singleton raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Jonathan stepped forward. "Mr. Singleton, how long did you work at Wilson Harrington?" Singleton cleared his throat. "About 5 years." "And your role there?" "Financial operations." Jonathan paced slightly, not because he needed to, but because it made the courtroom uneasy. "So, you had clearance for financial transactions?" Singleton hesitated. "Limited access." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Limited or the same access as me?" Singleton blinked. "The same?" Jonathan nodded. "Right. Now, What would you say if I told you that the same fraudulent transactions the prosecution uses against me were actually made from a computer registered under your employee ID? The entire room shifted. Singleton swallowed hard. Too hard. Objection! Grayson shot up. Your Honor, the defense is making unfounded accusations. Jonathan didn't flinch. Your Honor, if the prosecution had done a proper investigation, they'd know Mark Singleton's credentials were used for at least 2 of these transfers. He turned back to Singleton. So, do you still want to claim your access was limited? Sweat formed on Singleton's forehead. He shifted nervously, eyes darting to Dorsey, who sat stone-faced, avoiding him. Jonathan smirked inwardly. This told him everything. Singleton wasn't the mastermind. Dorsey was. Jonathan faced Judge Calloway. Your Honor, the prosecution claims the evidence against me is airtight. What they haven't mentioned is that company logs show another employee made transactions using my credentials. He clicked the screen, revealing a new document, an email record from IT Security. These emails show that one day before the fraudulent transactions began, an employee requested a credential reset for my work login. Jonathan turned back to Singleton. And that request came from your computer. Gasps filled the courtroom. Singleton froze, glanced at Grayson, then at Dorsey. Jonathan leaned in. Care to explain that? Singleton's mouth opened, then closed. His hands trembled. He knew he was trapped. Finally, he broke. I was just following orders, he said, voice wavering. I didn't know what it was for at first. Dorsey told me to... Objection! Grayson practically shouted, face reddening. Your Honor, that's hearsay! Judge Calloway held up a hand. Overruled. His tone sharpened as he addressed Singleton. You'd better clarify that statement. Singleton's breath hitched, hands gripping the witness stand. I was told to reset Ellis's credentials and pass them on to Mr. Dorsey. Jonathan turned to the jury. There it is. He looked back to Singleton, voice calm. So, you're saying Franklin Dorsey ordered you to access my login, make unauthorized transactions, and then let me take the fall? Singleton exhaled shakily. Yes. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury looked stunned, and Judge Calloway sat back, lips pressed tightly, deep in thought. Franklin Dorsey remained silent, motionless, no reaction. Grayson frantically flipped through his notes, desperately searching for a way to recover. Jonathan stood calm and composed. He knew the game had changed. Now, the judge, the jury, and even the prosecution knew the truth. What happened next would seal the case. The room buzzed with murmurs, gasps, and the scratch of pens on notepads. The jury exchanged looks. Some leaned back, arms crossed. Others sat upright, fully alert. Even Judge Calloway, who had spent most of the trial bored or amused, now wore an expression of genuine interest. But the man who mattered most, Franklin Dorsey, the corporate kingpin, until this moment, now sat stone-faced, eyes fixed ahead, shoulders rigid. Jonathan turned back to Mark Singleton, still visibly shaken. You're saying Franklin Dorsey ordered you to reset my login credentials, access financial accounts under my name, and carry out transactions framing me for a crime I didn't commit? Singleton swallowed sharply, knuckles white as he gripped the stand. I didn't know what he planned. I just did what I was told. Jonathan pressed on. Did you benefit from these transactions? Were you paid? A slight hesitation. Singleton swallowed hard. Not at first. Jonathan tilted his head. Not at first? Singleton's shoulders slumped. Dorsey gave me a bonus a few weeks after you were fired, $30,000. The jury reacted immediately. Someone whistled low. Reporters whispered rapidly into their recorders. Grayson looked like he wanted to disappear. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was a bombshell. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple, then turned to Franklin Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to hear from you now. But Dorsey, unsurprisingly, didn't move, blink, or acknowledge a thing. Jonathan, steady and confident, stood ready. Jonathan could feel the shift in power. The room was his now, but he wasn't finished yet. He walked back to the evidence screen and clicked once. A new document appeared. These, he said, turning to the jury, are the transaction logs from the offshore account where the stolen funds ended up. Now, let's see who really had access. Another click, another highlighted section. Jonathan stared directly at Dorsey. Ladies and gentlemen, these transactions weren't just linked to my login, they were also connected to a second set of credentials. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before speaking the name loud and clear. Franklin Dorsey. The courtroom erupted again. Dorsey's face barely changed, but the tightening of his jaw and clenched fists spoke volumes. Jonathan turned to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against me and request an investigation into Franklin Dorsey for fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice. The judge leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, studying Jonathan with newfound respect. Earlier he had laughed and mocked. Now there was only serious consideration. Then the judge sighed. Mr. Grayson, he said, addressing the prosecution, the defense has presented compelling evidence that directly contradicts the case against Mr. Ellis. Do you have any further arguments? Grayson hesitated, flipping through his notes, but knew there was nothing left to say. With obvious reluctance, he cleared his throat. The state has no further arguments, Your Honor. Jonathan kept his face neutral, but inside he knew he'd won. What happened next was a moment no one expected. Judge Calloway leaned back, exhaling slowly, his eyes scanning the courtroom. The once smug prosecution looked defeated. The jury sat still, absorbing the weight of what had unfolded. And Franklin Dorsey? He hadn't moved, not a word, no denial, no explanation, because he knew anything he said now would only bury him deeper. The judge lightly tapped his gavel, signaling for silence. The murmurs faded. Then he turned to Jonathan. Mr. Ellis, his voice calm and measured, no trace of earlier amusement. After reviewing the evidence presented, I find that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof in this case. He let the words hang before continuing. The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go. A wave of noise swept the courtroom. Jonathan breathed out slowly, absorbing the moment, not relief, but certainty. He had always known the truth. Proving it, however, was something else entirely. The judge wasn't done. I am also ordering an immediate investigation into Franklin Dorsey and Mark Singleton for their roles in this matter. He turned his gaze toward the prosecution. Mr. Grayson, I strongly suggest the district attorney's office reevaluate how they handle cases like this in the future. Jonathan caught the way Grayson swallowed hard. This case would haunt him, a wrongful prosecution on such a public stage. The DA's office would soon be looking for someone to blame. And Franklin Dorsey? He was already finished. Jonathan gathered his papers and tucked them into his folder, taking his time. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted everyone in that courtroom to remember this moment. When he finally walked toward the exit, he felt eyes on him, the jury, spectators, reporters. Just as he reached the doors, Judge Calloway spoke one last time. Mr. Ellis. Jonathan stopped. The judge studied him for a beat, then nodded with what almost sounded like reluctant respect. You argued your case well. Jonathan didn't smile or thank him. Instead, he simply replied, I know. Without looking back, he pushed the doors open and stepped into his freedom. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, people scrambled for statements. But Jonathan didn't stop for any of them, because this moment wasn't for them. It was for every person ever wrongfully accused, every person underestimated or told to take a deal because fighting back wasn't worth it. Jonathan had fought, and he had won, but not everyone gets that chance. That's the reality of a system that too often assumes guilt before innocence, a system that laughs in the face of those who dare to challenge it. Here's the truth. Intelligence is power. Knowledge is a weapon. And sometimes, the only way to beat the system is to know it better than they do. If you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or backed into a corner, remember Jonathan Ellis. And remember, the best way to prove them wrong is to never stop fighting.